Callum McTavish stood at his cabin window, watching the blizzard tear through the valley while his hands sorted grain into burlap sacks, the covered platform around his house keeping everything perfectly dry. 50 yards away, Fergus Drummond was trapped in his own cabin, unable to reach the separate barn where his entire harvest was slowly freezing and thawing into worthless mush. Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The smell hit Callum McTavish before he even opened the barn door. It was February 1852, and the winter had been brutal across the Dakota Territory. 3 months of snow, intermittent thaws, and bone-chilling cold had tested every homesteader's preparations. Callum had thought his preparations were adequate. He had built his barn the previous summer using techniques passed down from his father in Scotland. Solid timber frame, thick plank walls, and a roof that seemed tight when he had finished it in September. He had filled it with his harvest, 40 bushels of wheat and 20 of oats, enough to see his family through winter and provide seed for spring planting with surplus to sell. The barn stood 30 yards from his small log cabin, a distance that had seemed reasonable when he had selected the site, close enough to check on regularly, far enough to separate living space from storage. It was how everyone built on the frontier. House here, barn there, maybe a root cellar somewhere between. Standard practice refined over generations, but standard practice had not accounted for the gap in the roof boards that Callum had not noticed during construction. The gap was barely a quarter-inch wide, invisible from below, caused by a slight warp in one plank that had developed as the green wood dried through autumn. During normal rain, the gap would have been insignificant. Water would have run down the roof pitch without penetrating. But during the January thaw, when 2 feet of accumulated snow on the roof had melted over 3 days, water had found that gap. It had dripped steadily onto the grain stored directly below. Callum pulled open the barn door and surveyed the damage. 5 of his grain sacks showed dark staining. He cut one open and thrust his hand inside. The wheat was clumped and damp, already showing the white fuzz of mold. The smell was unmistakable, that sweet rotten odor of grain going bad. He checked the others. Same condition. 12 bushels, nearly a third of his wheat, ruined. But the wheat was not the worst of it. The oats, stored in wooden bins along the wall, had suffered worse. The temperature fluctuations of the past month, warm days bringing the barn interior above freezing, followed by nights dropping well below zero, had created condensation inside the barn. That condensation had settled on everything, including the oat bins. The grain had absorbed moisture, frozen, thawed, and frozen again. Callum scooped up a handful. The oats were discolored and had an off smell. Some showed ice crystals still clinging to the kernels. He spent an hour examining everything, hoping to salvage what he could. The final count was devastating. 12 bushels of wheat completely unsalvageable. Another 8 bushels degraded enough that they would fetch half price at best. The oats were worse. 15 of his 20 bushels were damaged, suitable only for animal feed at reduced value. He had lost more than half the value of his harvest to something as simple as moisture and temperature variation. Callum sat at the rough-hewn table in his cabin that evening, explaining the situation to his wife, Moira. The firelight cast shadows across her face as she listened, her hand still working at mending a shirt even as worry creased her forehead. Their daughter Isla slept in the loft above, unaware of the conversation that would shape their next year. The mathematics were brutally simple. Callum had planned on selling 30 bushels of wheat at market price to cover their basic needs: salt, sugar, ammunition, fabric, and the seed oats he would need since his own crop had failed. He had calculated conservatively, assuming decent but not premium prices. The remaining 10 bushels of wheat and 5 of oats would feed them through spring and early summer until the kitchen garden produced. Now, those calculations were worthless. He had perhaps 18 bushels of sellable wheat, and half of that was degraded quality. The oats were almost completely lost. He could sell what remained for animal feed prices, a fraction of what human-grade grain commanded. When he tallied the actual value of what he could sell against what he needed to buy, the deficit was approximately $40. $40 he did not have and could not easily acquire. Moira listened to the numbers without interrupting. When he finished, she asked the question he had been dreading. Could they make it through to next harvest? Callum considered the options honestly. They could survive, but barely. They would need to eliminate any purchase that was not absolutely essential. No new fabric meant making do with patched and repatched clothing. Reduced ammunition meant hunting only when necessary and making every shot count. Lower quality seed meant risking next year's crop on inferior stock. The real danger was not starvation, though that remained a distant possibility if circumstances worsened. The real danger was falling behind. Frontier farming operated on thin margins. One bad year could be overcome. 2 bad years in succession often meant abandoning the homestead and starting over elsewhere or returning east in defeat. Callum had invested 3 years of brutal work into this land. The thought of losing it because of moisture damage to grain storage felt intolerable. That night, lying in bed listening to wind howl around the cabin, Callum found himself unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to the barn, to that invisible gap in the roof, to the condensation forming on cold nights, to the simple fact that his food supply and his family's future sat in a building he could not adequately control or protect. The barn was 30 yards away. During the worst of the blizzards, he had gone 2 full days without checking on it because the wind and snow made the short journey dangerous. Anything could have been happening inside that building, and he would not have known. Moira stirred beside him, not sleeping either. In the darkness, she asked a question that would change everything. What if the grain did not need to be in a separate building? What if they could store it where they could always reach it, always monitor it, always protect it? Callum had no answer that night, but the question took root. Spring came late to the Dakota Territory in 1852. Snow lingered into April, and the ground remained frozen. Until early May. Callum used those weeks to visit every homestead within a day's ride, ostensibly checking on neighbors after the harsh winter, but actually studying how others stored their grain. What he found was not encouraging. Nearly every farmer had suffered some degree of loss. Fergus Drummond had lost 8 bushels to roof leaks. Alistair Boyd had discovered rodent damage that had destroyed 6 bushels before he had noticed the problem. Duncan Reed had fared better, losing only 3 bushels to moisture, but even that represented a significant financial setback. The pattern was consistent. Separate storage buildings meant problems that went unnoticed until damage was done. Roof leaks, rodent intrusions, temperature fluctuations, condensation. All of these issues occurred invisibly while families lived in their cabins, unaware that their stored wealth was degrading. Some farmers checked their barns daily, but even daily checks could not prevent damage that occurred overnight or during multi-day blizzards when leaving the cabin was impossible. Callum began asking questions that his neighbors found odd. How far was the barn from the house? How often could they check it during winter storms? Had they ever considered storing grain in the house itself? The last question generally produced puzzled looks. Houses were for living. Barns were for storage. This was foundational knowledge, as obvious as the fact that roofs went on top and doors went on the side. Mixing the two seemed unnatural. But Callum's mind kept working the problem from different angles. The cabin stayed dry because they lived in it, kept it heated, noticed any leak immediately and repaired it. The cabin stayed free of rodents because human presence deterred them. The cabin's interior temperature remained relatively stable because the fire burned daily. Everything that made the cabin good for living also made it good for grain storage. The problem was space. His cabin was perhaps 16 feet by 20 feet, a single room with a loft. There was no room for 40 bushels of grain among the furniture, supplies, and living space his family required. During those spring weeks, while preparing his fields for planting, Callum sketched ideas on scraps of birch bark with charcoal from the fire. He drew cabins with extended storage rooms. He drew underground cellars connected by tunnels. He drew second-story additions. None of the designs satisfied him. They were either too expensive, too complicated, or they failed to solve the fundamental problem of keeping grain accessible and protected during the worst weather. The answer came to him in late May while he was helping Duncan Reed repair a fence. Duncan's cattle had broken through during a spring storm, and the two men were resetting posts and restringing rails. They worked under a simple pole shelter Duncan had built to store his tools and lumber. The shelter was just a roof on posts, 3 sides open to the weather, but it kept the, tools dry and provided comfortable workspace even during light rain. Callum stopped mid-swing with the post maul and stared at the shelter. Duncan asked if he was all right. Callum spent the next week refining the idea before mentioning it to anyone. The concept was simple, but would require careful execution. Instead of building a barn separate from his cabin, he would build a barn structure around his cabin. A timber frame shelter with a roof extending well beyond the cabin walls, creating a covered platform on all sides. The cabin would sit in the center, protected and warm. The grain would be stored on the platform surrounding it, sheltered from weather, but accessible simply by stepping out the door. The advantages became clearer as he thought through the implications. First, the grain would be as accessible as opening his door, reachable even during the worst blizzards. Second, the cabin's warmth would radiate outward, moderating the temperature of the stored grain and preventing the freeze-thaw cycles that had ruined his oats. Third, any problem with the grain storage would be immediately obvious because he would walk past it multiple times daily. Fourth, the covered platform would provide dry workspace for processing grain regardless of weather, something he currently lacked entirely. The challenges were significant. He would need substantial timber for the frame posts and roof structure. The roof would need to be steeply pitched to shed snow effectively. The platform would require hundreds of board feet of plank lumber. He would need to engineer the structure carefully to ensure the roof could support heavy snow loads. And he would need to do all of this while also planting and tending his regular crop, as his family's survival depended on this year's harvest succeeding. Callum began with calculations. He sketched the cabin's current dimensions and planned a platform extending 12 feet beyond the walls on all sides. That would create approximately 900 square feet of covered storage and workspace. He calculated the timber needed for support posts, figuring posts every 8 feet around the perimeter, with additional interior posts to support the roof span. He estimated the roof pitch needed to shed snow at roughly 8 inches of rise per foot of run, creating a steep roof that would not accumulate dangerous loads. The lumber requirements were substantial. He would need 20 major posts, each at least 10 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. He would need ridge poles and roof supports. He would need enough planks to cover the entire platform, perhaps 2,000 board feet, and he would need additional lumber for the roof itself. The cost in labor would be enormous. The cost in materials, if he purchased them, would be prohibitive. But Callum owned timber land. He had access to straight pines and hardwoods. He had basic tools, axes, saws, a draw knife, an auger for drilling. What he lacked in money, he could substitute. With time and effort, he decided he could harvest the timber himself, work it to specification, and build the entire structure using primarily his own labor. It would take months. It would be exhausting, but it was possible. When he finally explained the plan to Moira, she listened carefully and asked practical questions. Where would they store supplies during construction? How would he manage both building and farming? What if the design failed? Callum admitted he could not guarantee success, but he could guarantee that another winter with grain stored in a separate barn would produce the same results they had just experienced. This was different. This might work. Callum began construction in early June. immediately after finishing his planting. The first task was selecting and felling the timber he would need for the major support posts. He spent 3 days in his woodlot, examining trees with obsessive care. He needed posts that were straight, approximately 10 inches in diameter, and free of significant defects. Each tree was evaluated, marked, and only then felled. His neighbors noticed the activity and began asking questions. Fergus Drummond stopped by on the 4th day, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but clearly curious about the pile of logs accumulating near Callum's cabin. Callum explained the basic concept. He was building a barn structure around his house to keep grain storage accessible and protected during winter. Fergus listened with growing confusion, then asked the obvious question: why not just build a better barn in the normal location? Callum explained his reasoning. Separate buildings meant problems went unnoticed. Integration meant constant monitoring and climate control from the cabin's heat. Fergus shook his head slowly. He had been farming for 15 years, built 4 different barns in that time, and never heard of anyone building a barn around a house. It seemed backward, like putting a fence inside a pasture or hanging a door upside down. He did not say Callum was wrong, but his tone suggested he thought the whole project was misguided. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteading community. Alistair Boyd visited 2 days later with his brother, both of them wanting to see what Callum was planning. Boyd was not diplomatic. He laughed when Callum showed him the sketches. Building a barn around a house was the stupidest thing he had heard of since coming west. Barns belonged away from houses. Everyone knew that. Mixing them was unnatural, inefficient, and a waste of good timber. Why build a massive shelter for a cabin that already had a roof? Callum tried explaining the grain storage logic, but Boyd was not interested in details. He saw a man planning to waste months of labor and substantial materials on something that violated basic building principles. He told Callum he was welcome to build whatever foolishness he wanted, but don't come asking for help when the whole thing collapsed or when he realized he had built himself into a giant, unusable barn. Duncan Reed's reaction was more measured but equally skeptical. He visited the following week and walked around the cabin while Callum explained the planned dimensions. Reed asked good questions about roof pitch, post spacing, and platform construction. But even after hearing the answers, he concluded that Callum was overcomplicating a simple problem. If the barn leaked, fix the leak. If rodents got in, get a cat. Building an entirely new structure around an existing cabin seemed like responding to a small problem with massive, untested solution. The mockery was not vicious, but it was consistent. Over the next 2 weeks, as Callum began setting posts and building the timber frame, neighbors who passed by would comment. Some joked he was building a jail around himself. Others suggested he was planning to stable horses in his bedroom. A few asked if his wife approved of living inside a barn. The implication was always the same. This was strange, unnecessary, and probably foolish. Callum ignored the comments and focused on construction. The foundation work began with laying out the structure's perimeter. He used stakes and string to mark where each post would be set, creating a rectangle that extended 12 feet beyond his cabin walls on all sides. The layout had to be precise. If the posts were misaligned, the roof structure would be weakened and the visual appearance would be obviously flawed. For each post location, Callum dug a hole approximately 3 feet deep. The soil was rocky, making the work brutal. Each hole took most of a day to excavate, chopping through roots, prying out stones, and creating a cavity large enough for the post base plus stone fill for drainage. He dug 20 holes over the course of 2 weeks, working in the early morning and evening to avoid the worst heat while still tending his growing crops during midday. The posts themselves required careful preparation. Each log was stripped, bark using his draw knife, a process that revealed the wood's true diameter and any hidden defects. Several logs he had cut proved unsuitable once stripped, showing rot or insect damage invisible beneath the bark. Those were rejected and replacement logs cut. The acceptable posts were then shaped at the base to create a flat surface that would sit level in the hole. Setting the posts was work that required help. Moira and even young Isla assisted, the three of them using ropes and leverage to raise each massive timber upright and guide it into its hole. Once vertical, Callum used a plumb line to ensure the post stood perfectly straight, adjusting with wedges, while Moira and Isla held guide ropes to prevent it from tipping. Then he filled around the post with rocks, tamping them tightly to create a solid base that would resist shifting. The posts went up slowly. By the end of June, all 20 perimeter posts stood in place, creating a forest of timbers surrounding the cabin. The visual effect was strange. The cabin looked imprisoned, surrounded by posts that seemed to have no obvious purpose yet. Neighbors riding past would stop and stare, some openly laughing at the bizarre appearance. With the posts set, Callum began the roof framework. This required horizontal beams connecting the posts at the top, creating a rigid structure that would support the roof itself. The beams were heavy timbers notched to fit over the posts and secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. Each beam had to be lifted to the top of the 14-foot posts, requiring block and tackle rigging that Callum fashioned from rope and pulleys borrowed from Duncan Reed. The work was dangerous. Callum worked alone at height, balancing on ladders while manhandling timbers that weighed over 100 pounds. One beam slipped while he was positioning it, falling and nearly striking him as it crashed to the ground. Moira insisted he wait for help after that, but help was difficult to arrange when most neighbors thought the project was foolish. By mid-July, the basic frame stood complete. Posts connected by beams created the skeleton of the barn structure, and the cabin sat in the center, looking small and vulnerable inside the massive timber framework surrounding it. The platform construction began with creating a level base. The ground around the cabin was not naturally level, sloping slightly downward to the south. If Callum built the platform directly on this surface, water would pool and the structure would settle unevenly. He needed to create a raised, level platform that would remain stable and dry regardless of ground conditions. His solution was a system of joists supported by the post framework and additional short posts where needed. He started by attaching horizontal ledger boards to the perimeter posts at a height of 18 inches above the highest ground point. These ledgers would support the outer ends of the joists. The inner ends would be supported by the cabin walls and intermediate posts he set specifically for this purpose. The joists were heavy timbers, 8 inches wide and 3 inches thick, spanning from the cabin walls to the perimeter ledgers. Callum spaced them 16 inches apart, closer than typical floor construction, but necessary to support the weight of grain storage plus the heavy traffic the platform would endure. Each joist was notched where it met supports, creating mechanical connections that would prevent shifting. Installing the joists required working in the confined space between the cabin walls and the perimeter posts. Callum crawled beneath the emerging platform, fitting each timber into position and securing it with wooden pegs and iron spikes he had purchased specifically for critical connections. The work was hot, dusty, and claustrophobic. Sawdust and wood chips rained down on him as he drilled and hammered overhead. With the joist framework complete, the actual platform decking could begin. Callum had milled planks during the spring, cutting logs into boards approximately 8 inches wide and 2 inches thick. These planks had been stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation and prevent warping as they dried. Now, 3 months later, they were ready for installation. He laid the planks perpendicular to the joists, fitting them tightly together. Each plank was secured with 2 iron nails at every joist crossing, creating a rigid surface that would not shift or squeak under foot traffic. The nails were expensive, but Callum had learned from his barn failure that cheap construction created expensive problems. He used quality fasteners at every critical connection. The platform grew steadily through late July and into August. Callum worked section by section, completing the south side first, then the east, north, and finally the west. As each section was finished, he could see the design coming together. The platform created a wide, level deck, completely surrounding his cabin. Step out any door, and you stood on solid, elevated planking that would remain dry even during heavy rain. The elevated design had drainage benefits Callum had anticipated and others he discovered during construction. Rain falling on the platform would drain through the gaps between planks and run off beneath the structure. Snow could be swept off easily without creating mud. The 18-inch elevation put the platform above typical snow accumulation, meaning even after heavy snowfall, the platform surface itself would remain accessible. By the end of August, the platform was complete. 900 square feet of solid decking surrounded the cabin, creating workspace and storage area that had not existed before. The roof was the most critical element of the entire structure. Without adequate weather protection, the platform would be useless. Callum had observed countless barn roofs during his spring visits to neighbors, noting which designs shed snow effectively and which accumulated dangerous loads. The pattern was clear. Steep pitch prevented accumulation, while shallow pitch invited structural failure. He calculated a roof pitch of 8 inches of rise for every 12 inches of horizontal run. This created a steep angle, approximately 33 degrees, aggressive enough to shed snow rapidly even during heavy accumulation. The pitch would make construction more difficult, but the alternative was a roof that might collapse under winter snow loads. The roof structure began with ridge poles running from the cabin's existing roof line outward to the perimeter posts. These poles were substantial timbers, 8 inches in diameter, capable of bearing the weight of the roof covering plus seasonal snow. Callum notched them to sit securely atop the perimeter beams, creating mechanical connections that distributed loads effectively. Between the ridge poles, he installed cross-bracing at 4-foot intervals. These braces prevented the ridge poles from twisting or bowing under uneven loads. Each brace was fitted precisely, creating a rigid framework that would support the roof covering without sagging or shifting over time. The actual roof covering presented choices. Most frontier buildings used either bark, sod, or split shingles. Bark was lightweight but deteriorated quickly. Sod was heavy but provided excellent insulation. Shingles were durable but required substantial labor to produce. Callum chose a combination approach that would maximize weather protection while remaining buildable. He started with a base layer of split planks laid across the ridge poles at close spacing. These planks created a solid surface that would support the final covering layers. Over the planks, he laid birch bark sheets in overlapping courses, working from the lower edge upward, so each course would shed water over the one below. The birch bark provided waterproofing, but Callum added another layer of protection. He had saved every scrap of canvas, hide, and heavy fabric he could acquire over the past months. These materials, though insufficient to cover the entire roof individually, could be pieced together in a patchwork layer over the bark. He laid them carefully, overlapping edges and securing them with wooden battens nailed through to the planks beneath. The final layer was sod, cut in rectangular sections from the meadow below his homestead. The sod pieces were heavy, each weighing perhaps 40 pounds, and required careful placement to avoid overloading any section of the roof. Callum worked methodically, distributing weight evenly and allowing the living grassroots to knit together over time. By mid-September, the roof was complete. The massive structure extended 12 feet beyond the cabin walls on all sides, creating a deep overhang that would protect the platform from rain and snow. Standing beneath it, Callum could see clear sky to the horizon, but felt completely sheltered from overhead weather. The final construction details consumed the last weeks of September. Callum built a step system at each cabin door, allowing easy access from the elevated platform to the ground. He installed simple railings at the platform's outer edge. primarily to prevent accidentally stepping off during dark winter mornings when visibility was poor. He added storage hooks to the perimeter posts, creating places to hang tools, harnesses, and equipment. He built a workbench along the north side, utilizing the covered space for tasks that previously required working outdoors regardless of weather. The bench was simple but functional, providing a surface for grain processing, tool maintenance, and general farm work. The structure's appearance was unlike anything in the territory. The cabin sat centered within a massive timber frame shelter, the steep roof creating dramatic angles that cast deep shadows across the platform. The visual effect was imposing, almost fortress-like, completely different from the typical scattered arrangement of cabin and outbuildings. Neighbors continued visiting, drawn by curiosity about the completed structure. Alistair Boyd came with several others, walking around the platform and examining the construction with obvious skepticism. Boyd admitted the workmanship was solid but questioned the entire premise. Callum had built a beautiful, well-engineered barn around his house. Why? What was the actual advantage beyond wasting months of labor? Callum tried explaining again. Grain stored here would stay dry. Temperature would remain stable. Everything would be accessible during storms. Boyd shook his head. A properly built barn would accomplish the same things without the absurdity of mixing living space with storage space. He predicted Callum would regret the design within one winter, finding the arrangement impractical and eventually building a normal barn anyway. Fergus Drummond was less harsh, but equally doubtful. He acknowledged that Callum's grain would certainly be accessible during winter, but wondered if the trade-off was worth it. The smell of stored grain, the dust from processing it, the risk of fire from having combustible materials surrounding your living space, these seemed like significant problems Callum had not adequately considered. Duncan Reed asked practical questions about how Callum would actually use the space. Where would the grain bins be positioned? How would he prevent moisture from the cabin affecting stored grain? What about ventilation? Callum had answers for most questions, but some, he admitted, he would need to resolve through experience. The community consensus was clear. Callum had built something impressive, but misguided. The structure was well made, the engineering was sound, but the fundamental concept was flawed. Houses and barns serve different functions and should remain separate. Mixing them created problems that would become apparent once Callum actually tried living with the arrangement. By early October, construction was complete. Callum stood on his platform in the evening, looking out across the prairie as the sun set. The structure had consumed 4 months of intense labor. His body ached from the work. But the platform was solid, the roof was weathertight, and he had created something unique. October brought harvest time across the territory. Callum's wheat and oats had matured well, despite his divided attention between farming and building. The crop was not exceptional, but it was adequate, perhaps 35 bushels of wheat and 18 of oats. Given last winter's losses, adequate felt like victory. Before harvesting, Callum needed to prepare the storage system. He had acquired 6 galvanized metal bins during a summer trip to the territorial market, each capable of holding approximately 6 bushels of grain. The bins were expensive, costing nearly $8 total, but they offered advantages over wooden bins or sacks. Metal would not absorb moisture. Rodents could not chew through it. The bins could be sealed with fitted lids, protecting contents from dust and pests. He positioned the bins strategically around the platform, 2 on the south side, 2 on the east, 2 on the north. This distribution spread the weight and kept any single area from becoming congested. Each bin sat on wooden blocks, elevating it slightly above the platform's surface to allow air circulation beneath and prevent any ground moisture from wicking into the grain. Beyond the metal bins, Callum had sewn heavy canvas sacks for additional storage. Canvas was more expensive than burlap, but more durable and better at moisture resistance. He had made 20 sacks over the summer evenings, each capable of holding approximately 2 bushels. These would store the overflow beyond what the metal bins could hold. The workspace organization was equally important. Callum set up his processing area on the north side of the platform where the roof overhang was deepest. Here, he positioned his winnowing baskets, cleaning screens, and the heavy stones he used for grinding small quantities of grain into flour. Everything was arranged for efficient workflow. Grain would move from bins to cleaning area to final storage or use. He built simple shelving along the perimeter posts, creating storage for the tools and equipment needed for grain processing. Scoops, measures, sacks, twine for tying filled bags, all of it organized and readily accessible. The arrangement transformed the platform from simple covered space into a functional workshop. Moira helped organize the household side of the integration. She identified which supplies could be stored on the platform versus which needed to remain inside the cabin. Root vegetables, preserved foods, and items requiring consistent warmth stayed inside. Grain, dried goods that tolerated temperature variation, and equipment moved to the platform storage. The first test came during a late October rainstorm. Heavy rain fell. For 6 hours, driven by gusty wind, Callum watched from inside the cabin as rain lashed the platform. The roof performed perfectly. Not a drop reached the platform surface beyond the outermost 18 inches, where wind drove rain at an angle beneath the overhang. Everything stored more than 2 feet from the platform edge remained completely dry. Harvest began in late October under clear autumn skies. Callum cut his wheat using a scythe, working in the methodical rhythm he had learned years earlier. The stalks fell in neat rows, drying in the field for 3 days before he gathered them into shocks for further drying. The process was traditional, unchanged for centuries, but where his neighbors hauled their cut grain to distant barns, Callum brought his directly to the platform surrounding his cabin. He set up threshing operations on the east side of the platform where morning sun provided good light and warmth. The process involved beating the dried wheat heads against a flat stone surface, separating grain from chaff. Normally, this work happened inside a barn, doors closed to prevent grain loss from wind. Callum worked in open air under his massive roof, the overhang protecting him from weather while allowing breeze to help carry away the lightest chaff. The grain accumulated steadily. Each day of threshing produced roughly 3 bushels of clean wheat. Callum filled his metal bins first, valuing their superior protection for the bulk of his harvest. The wheat poured into the bins with a satisfying rush, golden kernels mounding above the rim before he leveled them and fitted the lids. His daughter Isla helped with the lighter tasks, sorting grain and removing any remaining chaff or foreign material. She worked beside him on the platform, sheltered from autumn wind but comfortable in the crisp air. This was work that would have been impossible in a distant barn, too far for a child to safely travel back and forth, but the integrated design made it natural. By early November, the wheat harvest was complete and stored. 34 bushels filled the 6 metal bins with overflow going into canvas sacks stacked against the north wall. The oats came next, a smaller crop, but still respectable at 17 bushels. These went into canvas sacks exclusively, positioned on the west side of the platform for easy access when feeding the single horse Callum kept. The platform's appearance transformed as harvest progressed. What had been empty workspace became a well-organized storage area. Metal bins gleamed in the weak November sunlight. Canvas sacks stood in neat rows. Everything was visible, accessible, and protected. Callum could step out his door and immediately assess his entire food supply with a single glance. Neighbors passing by saw the accumulated grain and made comments. Fergus Drummond noted that Callum's harvest looked impressive, all gathered in one visible location, but wondered aloud how he would feel living next to all that grain when rodents started showing up. Alistair Boyd joked that Callum had built the territory's most expensive grain display, pretty to look at, but impractical for actual use. The mockery continued, but Callum noticed a change in tone. The comments were less harsh, more questioning. His neighbors could see the system worked for storage, even if they remained skeptical about winter functionality. The real test had not yet come. The first significant snow arrived on November 18th. Callum woke to find 4 inches of heavy wet snow covering everything beyond his platform. The prairie was white, his fields were buried, and the paths to his neighbors' homesteads were obliterated. But the platform remained clear, the steep roof having shed snow as it fell, and the deep overhang keeping the working surface completely dry. He stepped out his cabin door in shirt sleeves, morning coffee in hand, and walked the platform's perimeter. The contrast was stark. Beyond the platform edge, snow lay thick and undisturbed. On the platform, bare wood decking showed not a single flake. He could access any of his grain bins, use his workbench, or process grain without first shoveling or clearing any surface. Later that morning, he saw Fergus Drummond outside his own cabin, 50 yards visible across the snowy expanse. Drummond was shoveling a path from his door to his barn, the distance perhaps 30 yards, but requiring substantial effort in the heavy snow. Callum watched for a few minutes, then returned to his own tasks, which involved sorting oats for his horse's feed, work he accomplished while standing on a dry platform in relative comfort. The temperature dropped over the following days, and the snow remained. Most years, early snow melted within a week, but this system stalled over the territory, bringing persistent cold and occasional additional snowfall. By the end of November, 8 inches of snow covered the ground with drifts reaching 2 feet in protected areas. Callum's daily routine adapted easily to winter conditions. Each morning he stepped onto the platform, checked his grain storage for any issues, and selected what he needed for the day's cooking or animal feed. The work took minutes and required no outdoor clothing beyond what he wore inside the cabin. The platform temperature was noticeably warmer than the open air, buffered by heat radiating from the cabin walls. Moira appreciated the design in ways Callum had not anticipated. Laundry could be hung on lines strung beneath the roof overhang, protected from snow while still catching enough air circulation to dry. Firewood could be stacked on the platform, keeping it dry and eliminating the need to brush snow off logs before bringing them inside. The children could play outside without immediately tracking snow into the cabin, using the platform as a transitional space. The first real validation came during a visit from Duncan Reed in early December. Reed arrived on horseback, tying his animal at the platform edge and climbing up to the dry surface. He commented immediately on the comfort of the space. His own barn was a cold, dark building that required a lantern even at midday. Callum's platform had natural light from all sides and was noticeably warmer than outdoor temperature. Reed asked to see the grain storage, and Callum showed him the bins and sacks. Everything was dry, easily accessible, and well organized. Reed admitted the system worked better than he had expected, though he still questioned whether the massive construction effort was justified for what amounted to covered storage. The blizzard struck on December 19th with a ferocity that surprised even experienced frontier settlers. The storm built gradually through the afternoon, beginning as light snow that intensified hour by hour. By evening, wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted to well below zero. The blizzard would rage for 3 days, becoming one of the worst winter storms in territorial memory. Callum watched from his cabin window as the world disappeared into white chaos. Wind howled around the structure, testing every joint and connection. Snow accumulated rapidly on the ground, but the steep roof shed it continuously, the sound of sliding snow audible even over the wind. The platform remained clear, protected by the massive overhang that extended 12 feet beyond the cabin walls. On the second day of the storm, with visibility still near zero, Callum needed to feed his horse. The animal was sheltered in a small lean-to structure he had built against the platform's north side, accessible without leaving the covered area. He stepped out his cabin door into wind and blowing snow, but within 3 paces stood beneath the roof overhang, protected and able to work without difficulty. He retrieved oats from the canvas sacks on the west side, measured the appropriate amount, and carried it to the horse's shelter. The entire task took perhaps 10 minutes and required no heavy outdoor clothing. He wore his normal work clothes with a coat added for the brief exposure while crossing the platform. Had his grain been stored in a separate barn 30 yards away, the task would have been dangerous and potentially impossible in the blizzard conditions. That same day, Fergus Drummond was trapped in his cabin, unable to reach his barn where his grain and animal feed were stored. The distance was not great, perhaps 40 yards, but visibility was zero, and the wind chill was life-threatening. Drummond's livestock went unfed for 2 days because traveling to the barn risked becoming disoriented and freezing before finding shelter again. Alistair Boyd faced similar circumstances. His barn was 60 yards from his house, across open ground that had drifted with snow. He attempted to reach it on the first day of the blizzard and became disoriented 20 yards from his door. Only by following his own footprints back, barely visible, in the paw. Driving snow did he make it to safety. His animals suffered, and his own family rationed food because supplies stored in the barn were inaccessible. Duncan Reed, more cautious, did not attempt the journey to his barn at all. He waited out the storm with what supplies he had in his cabin, knowing his stored grain and most of his provisions were unreachable, but accepting this as the unavoidable reality of winter storms. Meanwhile, Callum maintained normal routines. He processed grain on the platform, selecting wheat for grinding into flour. He organized his tools. He even spent several hours repairing harness leather, work he could accomplish on the covered platform with adequate light and reasonable comfort. The blizzard broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snowdrifts reached 6 feet in exposed areas, and the temperature remained brutally cold. Across the territory, farmers dug out from their cabins, assessed damage to their buildings, and checked on livestock that had survived 3 days without care. The storm had been a severe test of every homestead's preparation and design. Callum's platform emerged from the storm essentially unchanged. Snow had drifted against the outer edges, but had not penetrated beneath the deep roof overhang. The working surface was clear and dry. His grain storage was untouched. The structure had performed exactly as designed, providing shelter and access throughout conditions that had isolated his neighbors. The weeks following the blizzard established patterns that would define the rest of the winter. Callum developed a daily routine that took full advantage of his covered workspace. Each morning after breakfast, he would step onto the platform and spend several hours processing grain for various purposes. Some wheat was ground into flour using hand stones, tedious work, but manageable in small daily quantities. Some oats were sorted and measured for horse feed. Some grain was cleaned and prepared for eventual sale. The platform's temperature remained notably warmer than ambient outdoor conditions. Heat radiating from the cabin walls raised the covered area's temperature by perhaps 10 to 15 degrees compared to open air. This was not enough to prevent freezing, but it moderated the extreme cold and made working outside tolerable for extended periods. Callum could work in regular clothes with a heavy coat, rather than requiring the full winter gear necessary for exposure to open conditions. Moira found unexpected advantages to the design. The covered platform became an extension of their living space during winter months. Activities that would normally require outdoor exposure could be done under the protective roof. Processing vegetables from the root cellar, repairing tools, maintaining equipment, even simple tasks like shaking out rugs or airing bedding, all could be accomplished on the platform regardless of weather. Young Isla used the space as a play area. She could be outside in fresh air without the danger of deep snow or extreme cold. The platform became her winter domain, a place where she built small structures from scrap wood, played with simple toys, and stayed active during months when most children were confined entirely indoors. The grain storage itself required minimal maintenance. Callum checked the bins weekly, looking for any signs of moisture, pest intrusion, or degradation. He found none. The metal bins sealed tightly. The canvas sacks shed any condensation, and the elevated platform prevented ground moisture from affecting anything. The grain remained dry and stable, its quality unchanged from harvest condition. Spring arrived slowly in 1853, winter reluctant to release its grip on the Dakota Territory. As the snow melted and travel between homesteads became possible again, neighbors began visiting and sharing stories of how they had survived the brutal season. The conversations revealed a pattern of loss and difficulty that Callum had avoided entirely through his unconventional design. Fergus Drummond arrived in late March with troubling news. He had lost nearly 15 bushels of grain to moisture damage over the winter. His barn roof, which had seemed adequate during construction, had developed leaks under the weight of heavy snow. Meltwater had dripped onto grain sacks for weeks before he discovered the problem. By then, significant damage was done. The grain showed mold, discoloration, and the unmistakable smell of rot. What remained sellable would fetch perhaps half of normal market price. Drummond's story was not unique. Alistair Boyd had suffered worse losses, nearly 20 bushels destroyed by a combination of roof failure and rodent intrusion. The mice had moved into his barn during the first heavy snow, finding shelter and an abundant food source. Boyd had been unable to reach the barn regularly during the worst weather, and the rodents had caused extensive damage before he could address the problem. Duncan Reed, usually the most careful and methodical of the local farmers, had lost 8 bushels to freezing damage. His barn was unheated naturally, and the temperature fluctuations throughout winter had caused repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The grain had absorbed moisture from condensation during warmer periods, then frozen solid during cold snaps. The resulting damage made much of it suitable only for animal feed rather than human consumption or premium sale. The pattern extended beyond Callum's immediate neighbors. Throughout the region, farmers reported similar problems. Inaccessible storage during blizzards, roof failures under snow loads, pest intrusions, temperature damage, and simple moisture accumulation had degraded grain quality across the territory. Some farmers had lost 30% of their stored harvest. A few had lost more than half. When neighbors asked Callum about his own winter storage, he reported 0 losses. His grain remained in the same condition as harvest day. The metal bins had performed perfectly, the canvas sacks showed no moisture damage, and the covered platform had prevented all the problems his neighbors faced. Every bushel he had stored in October remained sellable at full market price. The reaction to this news was mixed. Some neighbors expressed genuine interest in understanding how Callum's design had achieved such results. They asked detailed questions about the roof construction, the platform elevation, the bin selection, and the overall integration concept. Others remained skeptical, suggesting Callum had simply been lucky, or that his small-scale operation was not comparable to their larger storage needs. But the economic reality was undeniable. Callum would go to market with pristine grain, commanding premium prices. His neighbors would sell degraded grain at discount if buyers would take it at all. The financial difference was substantial, easily $50 to $70 across the community. That amount represented the difference between a comfortable year and a difficult one. Market day came in mid-April when the roads dried enough for wagon travel. Farmers from across the region converged on the territorial trading post, bringing their grain for sale to buyers who would ship it east. The trading post operated as the economic hub of the territory, the place where a year's agricultural labor converted into cash that would sustain families until the next harvest. Callum arrived early with his wagon loaded with carefully selected grain. He brought 20 bushels of his best wheat, holding back the remainder for seed and family use. The wheat had been sorted and cleaned on his platform during the winter months, every kernel inspected, all foreign material removed. The result was grain of exceptional quality, dry, uniform, and free of any defects. The grain buyer was a man named Thompson, who had operated in the territory for 7 years. He had developed a reputation for fair dealing, but sharp evaluation of grain quality. Thompson could assess a handful of wheat and determine its value within a few cents per bushel. His judgment was rarely disputed because his experience was extensive and his assessments were consistent. Thompson examined Callum's wheat with obvious approval. The kernels were plump and consistent in size. The color was good, indicating proper maturity at harvest. The moisture content was ideal, dry enough for storage but not desiccated. There was no evidence of mold, insect damage, or rodent contamination. Thompson offered $1.30 per bushel, a premium price that reflected the grain's superior quality. Over the following hours, Callum watched as his neighbors brought their grain for evaluation. Fergus Drummond's wheat, damaged by moisture over the winter, received an offer of 70 cents per bushel. The buyer noted the discoloration and slight musty odor, both indicators of degraded quality. Drummond accepted the price because he had no alternative, but the disappointment was visible on his face. Alistair Boyd's grain fared worse. The rodent damage and moisture problems had created grain that Thompson initially refused to buy at any price. After negotiation, Thompson agreed to purchase it for 50 cents per bushel, and only because he could blend it with better grain for animal feed markets. Boyd had brought 30 bushels, expecting perhaps $35. He left with $15, barely enough to cover his most basic needs. Duncan Reed's grain, damaged by freeze-thaw cycles, received 90 cents per bushel, better than Boyd's or Drummond's, but still substantially below premium price. Reed had hoped for higher value, but he understood the buyer's assessment was fair given the visible quality issues. The financial comparison was stark. Callum earned $26 from his 20 bushels. Drummond earned perhaps $12 from a similar quantity. Boyd's larger volume brought minimal return due to severe quality degradation. The difference was not merely academic. It represented real purchasing power for supplies, tools, and necessities. As farmers completed their sales and gathered to discuss the season, the conversation inevitably turned to Callum's success. How had his grain remained in perfect condition while everyone else suffered losses? Duncan Reed was the first to ask direct questions about replicating Callum's design. Reed had always been methodical and practical, willing to learn from others' successes. He visited Callum's homestead in late April, specifically to study the barn-around house structure and understand its construction principles. He walked the platform, examined the roof framework, and asked detailed questions about materials, costs, and construction time. Callum answered everything honestly. The structure had required 4 months of intensive labor. The materials had cost approximately $30 in purchased items, primarily iron hardware and specialized tools, though most of the timber had come from his own land. The design required careful planning and precise execution, but nothing beyond the capability of a competent builder willing to invest the effort. Reed took notes and made sketches. He was particularly interested in the roof pitch calculation and the platform elevation strategy. These elements, Callum explained, were critical to the design's success. Too shallow a roof pitch and snow would accumulate dangerously. Too low a platform and moisture would compromise the structure. The specific dimensions Callum had chosen were based on observation, calculation, and some educated guessing, but they had proven effective. Over the following weeks, other neighbors visited with similar questions. Even Fergus Drummond, who had been among the most skeptical during construction, came to examine the structure. Drummond's winter losses had been severe enough to overcome his resistance to unconventional ideas. He admitted that Callum's design, however strange it appeared, had solved real problems that traditional construction had not addressed. The questions followed predictable patterns. How much did it cost? How long did it take? Could it be built around an existing cabin, or did it require new construction? What mistakes had Callum made that others could avoid? Was the design suitable for larger operations or only small homesteads? Callum shared everything he had learned. He showed them the corner joints where posts met beams. He explained his bin selection criteria. He demonstrated how the platform drainage worked. He described the winter routine that had made grain processing comfortable and efficient. Nothing was held back or kept proprietary. If neighbors could benefit from his experience, he was willing to teach them. By summer, 3 homesteaders in the region had begun building similar structures. Duncan Reed started first, constructing a timber frame shelter around his existing cabin using principles he had learned from Callum. His design varied in some details. His roof pitch was slightly different and his platform was narrower, but the fundamental concept remained the same. Integration of living space and storage, covered workspace, elevated platform, steep roof for snow management. Fergus Drummond followed, though his construction was slower and more tentative. He built a smaller version, extending the shelter only on 2 sides of his cabin rather than all 4. The reduced scope lowered costs and labor requirements while still providing significant benefits over traditional separate storage. Even Alistair Boyd, who had mocked the design most harshly, began planning a modified version. His pride prevented him from admitting Callum had been right, but his financial losses had been severe enough to force reconsideration. The design that neighbors had called Callum's Folly became known throughout the territory as the shelter barn or sometimes the barn house. The name varied by region and who was describing it, but the concept remained consistent. A timber frame structure built around a cabin, creating covered workspace and protected storage accessible in all weather conditions. By 1855, variations of the design appeared on homesteads across the Dakota Territory and into neighboring regions. Not every farmer adopted it. The construction required significant labor and materials, resources some homesteaders could not spare. Traditional separate barns remained common, particularly on larger operations where the scale of storage needed exceeded what could reasonably surround a dwelling. But for small to medium homesteads where grain storage represented a family's entire food security and economic foundation, the shelter barn offered advantages that traditional construction could not match. The design evolved as others built their own versions. Some farmers extended the shelter only, partially around their cabins, creating L-shaped or U-shaped covered areas that reduced costs while still providing significant benefits. Others increased the platform width, creating larger workspace at the expense of more complex roof engineering. A few innovative builders incorporated livestock shelters into the design, housing animals beneath the same protective roof that sheltered grain storage. Callum watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. He had not set out to revolutionize frontier construction, only to solve a specific problem that had cost him dearly. The fact that others found value in his solution validated the months of labor and the mockery he had endured during construction. More importantly, it meant other families would avoid the losses he had suffered that first terrible winter. His own operation prospered. The shelter barn eliminated grain storage losses completely, allowing him to sell premium quality grain every year. The financial advantage compounded over time. Money that neighbors lost to spoilage and damage became capital. Callum could invest in improvements, better tools, and expanded operations. Within 5 years, his homestead was among the most productive in the region. Moira and Isla thrived in the integrated living arrangement. The covered platform became central to their daily lives, a workspace that blurred the line between indoors and outdoors. Isla grew up playing on that platform, learning farm work in a space that was both sheltered and open, protected yet connected to the prairie beyond. As Callum aged, the shelter barn's accessibility became even more valuable. Work that would have required trudging to a distant barn in all weather remained manageable because it was literally outside his door. The design that had seemed excessive when he was young and strong proved wise as his body felt the accumulated wear of frontier life. Years later, travelers passing through the territory would sometimes stop at pasabti, homesteads with shelter barns, and ask about the unusual structures. The stories varied, but most credited a farmer named Callum McTavish, who had built the first one back in 1852 after losing a harvest to weather damage. Some stories were accurate, others were embellished, but all recognized that someone had seen a problem differently and created a solution that worked. Callum never sought recognition for the design. He built it to survive, shared it because helping neighbors seemed natural, and lived his life without dwelling on whether history would remember his contribution. The shelter barns scattered across the territory were legacy enough, practical monuments to the idea that conventional wisdom was not always correct, and that sometimes the best solutions came from rethinking fundamental assumptions.